Isaiah chapter 8, starting in verse 1. It says, "Moreover the Lord said unto me, Take thee a great roll, and write in it with a man's pen concerning Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. And I took unto me faithful witnesses to record, Uriah the priest, and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah. And I went unto the prophetess, and she conceived and bare a son. Then said the Lord to me, Call his name Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, My father, my mother, the riches of Damascus, and the spoil of Samaria shall be taken away before the king of Assyria. The Lord spake also unto me again, saying, Forasmuch as this people refuseth the waters of Shiloh that go softly, and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son, now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels, and go over all his banks. And he shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even out to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. Associate yourselves, O ye people, and ye shall be broken in pieces, and give ear, all of ye far countries. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. Take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand, for God is with us. For the Lord spake thus to me with a strong hand, and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people, saying, Say ye not a confederacy. To all them to whom this people shall say a confederacy, neither fear ye their fear, nor be afraid. Sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. And he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling, and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, for a gin and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble and fall, and be broken, and be snared, and be taken. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples, and I will wait upon the Lord that hideth his face from the house of Jacob, and I will look for him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs, and for wonders in Israel, from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. And when they shall say unto you, Seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God for the living to the dead? To the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. And they shall pass through it, hardly bestead and hungry. And it shall come to pass that when they shall be hungry, they shall fret themselves, and curse their king and their God, and look upward. And they shall look unto the earth, and behold trouble and darkness, dimness of anguish, and they shall be driven to darkness. So, if you remember, if you were here last week, we read in chapter 7, we saw a prophecy of the virgin birth of Christ, and we also saw how there would be two kings that would come up against the southern kingdom of Judah. And those two kings would be the king of Israel and also the king of Syria. And so you have these two neighbor nations to the north, actually family. They were family, the 10 northern tribes, and then these people of Syria just slightly to the northeast. And so we're reading about those same people again here. So it says in verse 1, Moreover, the Lord said unto me, Take thee a great roll, and write in it with a man's pen concerning Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. And so Isaiah was told to get himself it says a great roll, so a big scroll, a great piece of paper that would be rolled up. And it says, and write in it with a man's pen concerning Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. Now, this is of little importance, but it is of a little bit of interest to me. Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, that's the longest word you're going to find in the Bible. You won't find a word longer than that one. Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. And that basically means hasten ye to the spoil or rush to the prey. It basically, the name is a call to action. And it's a call not just to action, but to a very specific action, which is to conquer, to destroy, to take over, to plunder. So we see here, it says in verse 2, And I took unto me faithful witnesses to record, Uriah the priest, and Zechariah, the son of Jeberechiah. Now remember, what was the standard in the Bible for, that you had to have witnesses? You had to have two. And so he brings himself two witnesses for this. He says in verse 3, "And I went unto the prophetess, and she conceived and bare a son. Then said the Lord to me, Call his name Maher-shalal-Hashbaz." So there's this child, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, and it says, "For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, My father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria shall be taken away before the king of Assyria." And so what's going to happen is this is judgment pronounced on Syria, and it's pronounced in the form of this story of Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. And so Maher-shalal-Hashbaz is the representation of the destruction of Syria here. And so it says, "The riches of Damascus," which is the capital of Syria, "and the spoil of Samaria shall be taken away before the king of Assyria." Now Assyria would conquer Syria, and it would take over the lands of Syria, and it would all become one nation of Assyria at some point. But do you remember what the capital of Assyria is? Nineveh. And so that's even further east. And so people from further away are going to conquer both this closer nation of Syria, and they're going to conquer and take over the 10 northern tribes. And we know from history that's what happened. We know from history that the Assyrian Empire took over that part of the land. We know from history, when you read in the New Testament about the Samaritans, they were from the region of Samaria, which is the land kind of between Galilee and between Judah. And it's a lot of that land, it belonged to the 10 northern tribes, who kind of extended a little bit north of it and just slightly a little bit southwest of it. But this region of Samaria, the Assyrians, what they would do anytime they conquered any kingdom, they would start importing people from other places in their empire and exporting people from that place to other places in their empire. So that way they would all mix together and intermarry, and the religious beliefs would spread. So that way they would have a shared religion in their kingdoms. That way everybody would be believing and following the same thing. It would be easier to control everybody. And their religion was basically the same religion that the Babylonians practiced. It's the same religion that the Canaanites practiced. It's all basically the same. They had a little bit different names for different gods and different concepts, but they all believed basically in the same polytheistic pantheon of these false gods and goddesses. And so that's what they would do. And they conquered and they plundered and they took over. So it says in verse 5, "The Lord spake also unto me again, saying, Forasmuch as this people refuseth the waters of Shiloh that go softly, and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son. Now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria." So it says, "Forasmuch as this people refuseth the waters of Shiloh that go softly." So God is giving them a picture. They have this choice. They could choose this one river that God is providing them. He says the waters of Shiloh that go softly. That word Shiloh means peace. And there was a city called Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle originally rested when they came into the land, and that word meant peace. He was offering them these still, smooth, easy waters. They didn't take that. They didn't take the best that God had to offer. They instead chose, it says, "and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son." So they instead chose their king and the relationship that their king had with the Syrian king. And they chose that alliance in favor of God. Rather than God, that's what they chose. So he says, "Now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria in all his glory." So again, sticking with this picture of the waters of this river, he says, "Bringeth upon them the waters of the river, strong and many." So instead of this little lazy winding creek. If you've ever been on a lazy river or seen anybody on a lazy river, you just sit on a tube and you just kind of wind around real slow and nice and gentle and easy. Or if you've ever, I've never done it, but there are people who like to go tubing down a river, and they'll just get themselves a cooler or something, put some pop in there and some ice, and they'll just float down the river for a little ways, just relax. That's kind of the picture that they have here, the waters of Shiloh that go softly. But it says here, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river strong and many. Imagine going from that to Whitewater Rapids. Now some people like going whitewater rafting. I know some people do. That's not exactly my kind of thing. If you like to do that, that's fine. But if in your everyday life, if you had to choose, God's blessings and the peace that He offers as opposed to the chaos of the world and sin, you would choose God's blessings if you had any sense to you. That would be the choice that you would make. But these people didn't make that choice. And so what they're going to get is these whitewater rapids, this strong river. It says, even the king of Assyria in all his glory. It says, and he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks. And so God is going to multiply the strength of this man. And in this metaphor, this picture of the river, He's going to cause him to exceed what he normally could. He's going to go over his banks. He's going to go over his channels. He's going to exceed the strength and pressure that he would normally be able to exert, because God is going to allow him to do that. Because God is going to use him as a force of judgment. Now that doesn't mean God is blessing the nation of Assyria either. He's using them as judgment. He's not switching sides. God doesn't do that. He chose His people. He made a covenant. There is no switching sides. But He's going to use them as an instrument. It says, and he shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. And he shall reach even to the neck. And the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land. O Emmanuel. And remember, we saw that Jesus would be called Emmanuel in chapter 7. And I said, I made a reference to that not every time you see the word Emmanuel is it a reference to Jesus Himself. The word literally means God with us or God is with us. And so I think what here is a sarcastic statement by God through the prophet Isaiah. He said, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. The people of Israel and the people of Judah, who so casually believe that God will protect them through anything, who so casually believe that no matter what they do, they've got this Creator in the sky who's gonna give them blessings, who's gonna be there for them when they most need it throughout their most perilous times. And it doesn't matter what they do, because He's just always going to be there. He's with us. He's there. That's not the case. That isn't the case. That's the attitude they had a lot of times. But that isn't the case. God will allow them to be judged. He will allow them to suffer these hardships. He will allow them to suffer this tribulation, these troubles, these trials. And so I think He's making a sarcastic statement there by calling them, O Emmanuel, because they believe so casually that God is with them whenever they're living in outright sin and outright detestable behavior, and God is not okay with that. So it says in verse 9, associate yourselves, O ye people, and ye shall be broken in pieces. And give ear, all of ye far countries. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. And so what he's saying is, do your very best to these outside nations, to these external nations. Do your very best. It's not going to matter. Give it everything you've got. Gird yourself up. Prepare yourself. And you're going to be broken. Prepare yourself. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. He says in verse 10, take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand. For God is with us. And so the thing is that Assyria did come. Assyria did come to the 10 northern tribes, and Assyria took them over. Assyria came and destroyed a lot of the land. He destroyed a lot of the land in Judah. Now we know that the Assyrians did not take over the kingdom of Judah. They did not destroy totally the kingdom of Judah. It still stood. It stood until the Babylonians came. We know that. And so what we have here is it doesn't matter what Assyria does. It doesn't matter what any of these external nations do. It doesn't matter what Judah and Syria do, or what Israel and Syria do. Israel and Syria were judged completely and fully at that time. Judah was judged, but not completely and fully. They were allowed to stay. And so it says in verse 11, "Now, for the Lord spake thus to me with a strong hand, and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people, saying, Say ye not a confederacy to all them to whom this people shall say a confederacy, neither fear ye their fear, nor be afraid." And so what he's prophesying to Judah is, don't get caught up in this. Don't get caught up in anything. If somebody invites you to be a part of some grand alliance, if somebody invites you to be part of a greater community of nations, a greater league of nations, a greater united nations, don't buy into it, because that's not going to save you. What God has planned is what will save you. You can see, and you see that today. We have the Organization of the United Nations. Hasn't stopped war. It hasn't. In fact, the United Nations has sponsored wars in many, many, many different places. It's not peaceful. We don't live in a peaceful earth. We live in a peaceful country. And so we don't really even, any of us, Joe probably has better understanding of it than anybody else in this room. Those that I know anyway. I don't know these gentlemen. But different countries, they're very different. It's very different whenever you go outside of our borders and you go to different places on earth. They experience things that we never experience. I didn't experience them when I was in Israel. I didn't experience those things. I heard about them, from people around me, and I heard the news about them. I think I mentioned when I was over there, not the day that I was on the Temple Mount, but the day after, somebody had thrown a firebomb at somebody on the Temple Mount. There's a lot of stuff that goes on. Not the day that I was in Tel Aviv, but the day before I was supposed to go to Tel Aviv, somebody had fired rockets on Tel Aviv. Now, that military, they've got technology that allows them to shoot these rockets down before they ever impact. I think that's God's blessings that they have that technology, that they're not going to totally destroyed at this point. But, that's not because of anything that man does. That's because of God's blessings. But the blessings that we have are different than the blessings that have been given to other nations. And I think you're starting to see those go away. I think in this country you're starting to see those blessings fade because we're rejecting them. We're rejecting God's blessings. We're rejecting His favor, and we're rejecting that in favor of a world community that's going to usher in some kind of peace. And the warning that's given to Judah, I think, is the same warning that we should be paying attention to. Because, as we know, what's going to happen when the Antichrist comes, and we're not going to go through, Ron's been going through the book of Revelation. I'm not going to go through and reread chapters 1 through 7 at this point. But as we know, the Antichrist is going to come, and he's going to usher in that false peace. And he's going to do that by bringing the nations together and putting them in one place and saying, I'll be the leader. I'll work it out. I'll bring in the peace, and we'll establish this. And what happens is that peace lasts falsely for a short period of time, and then it collapses. And it turns into all-out warfare all over the place. And so, that's going to be the conclusion there. So it says, Say ye not a confederacy to all them to whom this people shall say a confederacy, neither fear ye their fear, nor be afraid. Now it says in verse 13, sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. Let the Lord be in charge. Let God be in charge. Let him be the one who is responsible. He says, and he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, for a gin and for a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now it says here, trust in God and let him be your fear and let him be your dread. But then it also says here in verse 14, and he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel. So that can be a little bit of confusion there if you're not following along, because here this is a reference now to when Jesus actually comes to the earth. And if we look in 1 Peter chapter 2, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 8. And we'll read, we'll start in verse 6 here and read down to verse 8 in 1 Peter chapter 2. It says, 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 6, wherefore also it is contained in the Scripture, behold, I lay in Sion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he that believeth on him shall not be confounded. Okay? Unto you therefore which believe he is precious, but unto them which be disobedient. So he says, now, all these things are true, unto you therefore which believe he is precious. And then he says, but unto them which be disobedient, the stone which the builders disallowed, the same is made the head of the corner, and a stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense, even to them which stumble at the word, being disobedient, whereunto also they were appointed. And so here we see Peter talking about how the Jews chose to have Jesus crucified. The Jews chose to kill this man who is supposed to be the national Savior and the global Savior. And they chose to get rid of him. They chose to kill the Son of God, and they refused that. And so he says, that very stone which the builders disallowed, that one is the chief cornerstone. That one is the one that lays the foundation. Jesus is the foundation. But to them, he wasn't that cornerstone. To them, he was a stumbling block and a rock of offense, something that was in their way. That's how they saw it. And so that's the same thing here. And he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, back in Isaiah 8:14. For a gin and for a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And so that's what it's referencing there. It says in verse 15, and many among them shall stumble and fall and be broken and be snared and be taken. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. And I will wait upon the Lord that hideth his face from the house of Jacob, and I will look for him. And so what we're seeing here is a reference both to this period of time and to the church age and to, I think, the tribulation. There's all kinds of applications from this little passage here. Many among them shall stumble and fall and be broken and be snared and be taken. So many among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. Now we know that there were many that stumbled and fell and were broken whenever Babylon came in. We know there were many that stumbled and fell and were broken after the crucifixion of Jesus in AD 70, 30-odd years later. We know that. And it says, and we know that there are going to be plenty of people in Jerusalem who are taken out during the tribulation. We know there's only going to be 144,000 Jewish people that even make it through to the end of that. And so I think that you could apply that verse to any of those, but I think the main application that we see in verse 16, bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. Verse 17, and I will wait upon the Lord that hideth his face from the house of Jacob, and I will look for him. I think that biggest reference, I think the largest and most key reference there is to the church age, because the people of Israel in the church age, most Jewish people reject Jesus. And so it says that hideth his face from the house of Jacob. It's not necessarily that God is not allowing them to get saved. That's not the case, because God's plan is for all to be saved. He doesn't pick and choose. At some point in a human being's life, everyone is drawn by the Father. Everyone is drawn by the Holy Spirit to come to the knowledge of the Father through Jesus Christ. And unfortunately, there are those who reject it. Unfortunately, there are those who never become saved. There are those who put it off and put it off and put it off. Either they put it off or they just refuse to believe outright. And their place is in hell. And so it says, the Lord that hideth his face from the house of Jacob. What's going on there is, it's not that he's deliberately preventing them from getting saved. It's that they're rejecting him, and so he's rejecting them. That's what's happening. And you see that in the church age today. The Jewish people are not the most influential people in the world. They are not the most influential nation in the world. Israel is not. Now, it's one of the central nations for conflict, and in that sense, it's still really influential. But they don't set world policies. They don't set, the direction of the world government that we see cropping up today. In fact, the world government is often set against them. So, we see in verse 18 now, behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. It says in verse 19 now, and when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God, and for the living to the dead? And so there's a warning here given to the people, because people, there would be those who would come to them and say, well, it's only natural you should seek your God. It's only natural that you should seek wisdom from the dead. These people with familiar spirits and these people who call themselves wizards. Well, this is only natural. This is what you should be doing. You should be seeking the wisdom here. No. It says in verse 20, to the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. If somebody's trying to give you a source of truth, a source of pure, unmediated truth, and it's not the Bible, it's fallible. If it's not the Bible, it's fallible. It's not a perfect source of unmediated truth, because God is the only perfect source of unmediated truth, and He gives us that unmediated truth through His Word. And if things are not according to the Scriptures, then they are not true. And so he says, to the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. It says, and they shall pass through it, hardly bestead and hungry, and it shall come to pass that when they shall be hungry, they shall fret themselves and curse their king and their God, and look upward. And they shall look unto the earth, and behold trouble and darkness and dimness of anguish, and they shall be driven to darkness. And so really briefly, I'm going to look over at Revelation chapter 16. Revelation chapter 16. And this is the vial judgments, or what we might call the bowl judgments, in Revelation chapter 16. And if you look, and starting in verse 8, it says, and the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain. And 10 and 11 is where I want you to pay attention. So we just read 10. It says, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. And so I think that what we read about in verses 21 and 22 is what we're reading about here in Revelation chapter 16, verses 10 and 11 specifically. It says, and they shall pass through it hardly bestead and hungry. And it says, they will curse their king and their God and look upward. And then it says, and they shall look unto the earth and behold trouble and darkness, dimness of anguish, and they shall be driven to darkness. And so what we see here is the beast, the Antichrist, his kingdom is full of darkness in Revelation chapter 16. It says they gnaw their tongues for pain. They're not able to eat. They're gnawing at their tongues, and they aren't really able to eat. It says, and blaspheme the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. And so what we're seeing here, I think, is both a picture of and also a direct reference to. It's a double application of prophecy. It's prophecy of something that was to happen shortly, and it was also prophecy of something that was to happen much later on down the line that still hasn't happened yet today. And so they would be driven to darkness under the Babylonian reign. They would be driven to darkness at the attack of the Assyrians whenever they all had to huddle up in their city. But I think that is fully it is fully fulfilled. It is completely fulfilled at the coming of the tribulation. It is completely fulfilled in the judgments that God will unleash on the world by allowing Satan and the Antichrist to have their way with the earth for a short period of time. Doesn't seem like a short period of time, but Jesus says that unless those days be shortened, he basically says nobody would make it through unless they were shortened. So it's a short period of time that this is allowed to go on for judgment's sake. And that what we just read about will be fulfilled at that time. This hunger and this fret and this cursing and blaspheming God. It will be done at that point. So, been trying to make it a little bit shorter, been trying to get through these a little bit quicker so that way we'd have time for any questions or comments. And so we actually, I'm meeting that goal. So we do have some time for questions and comments if anyone has any. So, anybody have any?